Hi, Mickey.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing okay.
Yeah, Happy New Year. You make any resolutions?
Did I make any resolutions? Yes, I did.
You want to share them with us?
I don't think so.
Just asking. We're going to be talking about free will toward the end, and maybe we could bring them up at that point.
I'm trying to exercise free will. We could.
Okay.
Why don't you try to do that?
We'll tantalize people with that and move right on to what? Saddam Hussein?
Yeah, by the way, it's possible that an electrician will show up at some point, disrupting the proceeddings. But
you don't mean the Saddam execution, because that's already happened. You mean disrupting this dialogue?
Correct.
Although
Correct.
an electrician actually might have been a better way to do it, given the way things turned out. But
you remember that old Fireside Theater routine, waiting for the electrician or someone like him?
No, I don't.
You don't know. You weren't a stoned humor guy in the 60s.
I remember the kids in high school who were tuned into that. I was too busy wasting time in other ways.
You can reveal those to us later. I saw the Saddam video. They actually have it up on Slate.
Yeah.
I just didn't think it was that bad.
Bad in what sense? I mean, of course, first of all, there's the question of should you kill the one guy who knows how to keep Iraq from having a civil war? But I guess it's too late for him to do any good in that regard.
Well, they seem to feel that they have to give the Shiite radicals this gift in order to get them back on board or something. I don't know. There was some Maliki was pursuing some strategy in doing it now.
You mean in terms of the haste of it? Yeah.
Yes.
He seemed to want to get it done.
He seems to want to get it done. He seemed to think it was going to appease the Sadras, and one of his aides called it our gift to the Iraqi id. In the New York Times. So there was something going on there. But basically, I mean, Don Imus said he couldn't imagine it could be any worse, and Tom Brokaw agreed, and you could easily imagine it being much worse. And he's standing there on the gallows. A few people yell some things at him. He yells back at them. He gives as good as he gets, and he falls through the trapdoor.
So what would have been worse?
Well, they could have been throwing things at him. They could have been
eggs and tomatoes would have really been going too far, I think.
Sorry?
Well, no, I mean, I kind of feel this. I mean, if you've just read the account of how it went and you watch the video doesn't seem quite as raucous as what you had been expecting. On the other hand, it did go pretty badly. I mean, first of all, he did actually handle it with some resolve and dignity, so far as I could tell. Although the revealing video was so grainy, it was hard to be sure. But he kept up the repartee with them apparently, which is probably not that easy to do when you know you're about to die. Then he did the Muslim profession of faith, and as fate would have it, so far as I could tell, the last word out of his mouth was Muhammad. And so you can imagine some jihadists making use of that video, although, of course, traditionally, he is not a friend of the jihadists. I mean, that's one reason the war actually probably wasn't a great idea. He had traditionally been a secular ruler and was no hero to the jihadists. But still, you kind of wish, I think a better outcome would have been if he had been in some sense pathetic, or if they had not heckled him like that. I actually think those would have been better outcomes from our point of view.
Those would have been better outcomes, but it could have been. The point is, it could easily have been worse. It's a little like firing somebody. People always say, "Well, it's not that he fired him; it's how he did it." Those concerns usually drop away over the course of time, the procedural concerns, and it just didn't. So the Sadrs made fools of themselves. I mean, that doesn't. It does show that the Iraqi government is incapable of keeping sectarians out of even its, most elite, narrow, tasks.
Yeah.
Which is pretty bizarre.
I mean, I think it plays a lot worse beyond Iraq than within it, in a sense. Of course, a lot of the Sunnis will hate it, but they were already about as worked up as they're going to get, probably. I don't see it giving them a whole major energy boost or anything. So. I agree. I mean, the interesting thing to me is just still this whole transparency issue. It gets back to the Michael Richards thing and just so many things these days. I mean, you know, and this era is just starting. Most people don't have cell phones that they know how to use to capture video, but it's gonna get to the point where just nothing escapes documentation. I was really surprised that, you know, there was a story here on the East Coast about this really touching story about this black guy who jumps down on the subway tracks to save this white guy. Did that?
That was unbelievable. Yeah.
That was great, and I'm surprised they didn't have video at least of the aftermath. Right? I haven't seen anything. You know, of after the train, after they emerge, once the train has you know gone.
I saw. Well, it took 20 minutes to extricate him, which is, I guess, why it's even more surprising they don't have video.
Right, but anyway,
well, I should say what was unbelievable was not that a black guy was rescuing a white guy, but the method that he chose to do it. He didn't pull him from the tracks. He pushed him down into the center of the tracks and lay on top of him.
Yeah, see, I didn't even know you could do that.
Not what I would think of doing.
No, but the guy was like a construction worker, right? So he has a little more insight into the way these nuts and bolts things operate than you and me, maybe. No, that was great. But on this on the transparency front, I mean, I would, you know, in an attempt to keep my record intact of turning everything against the Bush administration, ultimately, I would say these kinds of technologies are a reason that the war was misguided. These are fundamentally anti-authoritarian technologies. This is an example where a government wanted to keep something secret. It was unable to do it. And these are the kinds of technologies that were going to make his grip on power more and more untenable over the next 5 or 10 years. And, of course, that's meager consolation that an authoritarian is doomed in 5 or 10 years if he's got nuclear weapons or is developing them. But we were in the process of learning through the United Nations inspectors that he, in fact, did not,
also,
and we cut that short.
In fact, the fact that he was going to collapse was cited by Andrew Sullivan in your previous dialogue as one of the reasons for going in, because who knows, what's going to happen. Who knows who would control Iraq after that? And the other thing is, you know, that this cuts both ways. If you buy the idea that the purpose of the war was to spread the democracy meme, then, you know, the only way you fight a meme is with a meme, and that was that at least was operating at the right level, even if it was a doomed strategy.
Well, and an unnecessary one. I'm saying technology is on the side of the democracy meme, and we should harness that and at least be cognizant of it. Neither of those things, seem to have happened so far in terms of our government.
I see. Okay. I have a larger point and a smaller point about Iraq. The larger point is I'm starting to be unconvinced that things are going that horribly.
You're a tough sell, Mickey.
No, it's you get used to anything, so hell becomes the new normal.
Right.
And once so there are 100 American soldiers dying a month, and there's this sectarian violence in Baghdad, and a few people get holes drilled in their heads and tortured and killed. But the Iraqi politicians don't seem to be particularly bothered by it.
Well, what do you mean they're not bothered by it? They're adapting to it, as politicians will do, but they're not adapting in a way that fills me with hope. They're basically positioning themselves for a civil war.
Are we sure that that's what's happening? I mean, there are all these talk. This is the second point. There's all this talk about, two sorts of alliances, and I haven't the faintest idea which one is accurate. It's as if they're two parallel universes. There's Bush, who is pursuing this front of the moderates, which is an alliance based on, I think, Skiri. Is that the right way to pronounce it? One of the Shiite groups that has militias, and some moderate Sunnis to exclude Sadr. And the other, which Juan Cole talks about, is Sadr is talking to the moderate Shiites, presumably to form a coalition that excludes Skiri. And that doesn't seem to be jockeying for a civil war, is it? It's jockeying to form a new government within the existing framework of democracy. Now, maybe.
Well, no, I would say it's jockeying to see who controls the government on one side of the civil war. I think the assumption increasingly is that the Sunnis are going to be out of the picture, and if the Shiites can peacefully resolve their issues, then there'll be a united front against the Sunnis. That's a pretty simple civil war, and if they can't, it'll be a really complicated civil war.
Both these scenarios, which both involve a split in the Shiites, are negotiations between one Shiite faction and some Sunnis. if it's inevitable that the Sunnis are going to be in a civil war, why would they try to form an alliance with Sadr or with Skiri? I guess the argument is that they both want to get the Americans out, and once they get the Americans out, then they can go at each other. That is, in fact, the scenario that Juan Cole.
So you're saying a lot of Sunni politicians are actively participating in this attempt to be part of one of the coalitions?
Well, some are, and the bizarre thing is that they're talking to Sadr, who's supposed to be their sworn enemy. I actually sent an email to Juan Cole last night, and he responded on his blog today explaining that, yes, even though Sadr's people are slaughtering Sunnis in Baghdad, he has better relations with the Sunnis than actually Skiri does.
Well, he has positioned himself as really a kind of Iraqi nationalist, notwithstanding the tension with Sunnis, and Skiri, or whatever, is more closely associated with Iran, and hence, the dreaded Persians from the Sunni point of view.
Right, so the question is, in trying to build our coalition around these guys associated with Iran, are we backing the wrong Shiite? Maybe we should try to build a coalition around Sadr, although that's sort of almost unthinkable at this point.
Well, he seems like a pretty creepy guy. On the other hand, to the extent that we're, that we're betting on Skiri, that I think further reduces leverage we have over Iran, because we need Iran's well, I don't know. Maybe we need Iran's cooperation regardless. I don't really know. But your optimism is refreshing. Let me say that.
Well, and the other possibility, which Juan Cole took seriously enough to respond to, he didn't disagree with, is that if these guys can get together when we're gone, then we can go without there being a bloodbath. Sullivan, in his classic fashion, has on his blog, well, there will doubtless be genocide and hideous ethnic cleansing if we leave, but he's for leaving anyway. But maybe there won't be genocide and hideous ethnic cleansing if some sort of deal can be struck between one of these guys and some Sunnis. Now, Cole thought it was not going to happen, but he didn't rule it out as implausible.
Oh, if you can wind up with, but then what happens to the other group of Shiites in your scenario?
I guess they get cast out, and the Saddamists and the Al Qaeda.
And Muqtada al-Sadr is not the kind to get his back up over something like that, is he?
No. I assume that the idea would be to pursue those Sunnis that Sadr admits he goes after, which are the Saddamists and the Al Qaeda people, but that there be a bunch of Sunnis who aren't them who could be part of this effort. I don't know. Look, Juan Cole knows more than I do, and I also want points for reaching out to Juan Cole after your spurious attack on me for cocooning last week.
I'm glad that had the intended effect, Mickey.
Not only do I read Juan Cole, I email Juan Cole.
And there have been testy exchanges between you. I'm glad to hear he responded civilly. That's good. I haven't read it.
Like all bloggers, you have testy exchanges, and then you're civil.
Well, and you're hoping the Iraqis are like that. I hope so, too. Because they've had some testy exchanges over the last few years.
I'm hoping Sullivan is like that, but I'm not hoping for the Iraqis.
Okay.
But, anyway, I just, why is it, why are we in the grips of a hideously tightening vice, as Sullivan said, in Iraq? Why aren't we at a steady state where we lose 1,200 soldiers a year and it just goes on and on and on?
Well, the reason steady state doesn't seem to be the case is that if you focus on any variable other than the number of American soldiers dying, which to my mind is one of the, with all due, respect for the families and so on, in strategic terms, is one of the less important variables. It's not really, compared to other wars, it's not a lot of Americans dying. If you focus on any other variable, they're getting worse. That's why. No, steady state is just not the right. Last time you said, we were on a glide path to success until they bombed this mosque. Actually, even at that point, if you looked at the variables, Mickey, number of Iraqis dying, so on, I think you would have found they were actually getting worse. So glide path was kind of the opposite of the right term.
Have you looked at that? Because I bet that's not true.
Okay, well, we'd have to agree on which variables, but I think in terms of
the variables,
it's certainly not the case that number of Iraqis dying was a number that was improving at that point, Mickey. And the term glide path to me suggests that something's looking up. There's some basis for hope. Show me some variables that were getting better at that point.
We'll look at it. Brookings publishes these variables, and we'll look at them before the bombing of the mosque and after the bombing of the mosque. That's a good exercise.
Okay.
And see what happens. But But there is one variable that's still improving, which is the Iraqi economy. One rationale that I can see behind this troop surge is that it buys Bush 2 more years for the Iraqi economy to pick up and employ some of these unemployed men. So it's just not true that all variables are going in the bad direction. Plus,
what's going up? GDP?
I assume so.
Well, what do you mean when you say the economy's getting better?
Yeah, that's what there have been reports by various World Bank-issue institutions
that the economy is in some sense getting better.
Yes, and I believe they forecast economic growth, which is, I guess, measured by GDP.
Commonly.
So, the question is why is the killing inevitably going to get worse? You would think it would get better as the neighborhoods become ethnically cleansed. Then there are fewer people to chase out.
Well, there is the point at which it'll become the landscape will be so ethnically homogeneous that a partition solution becomes imaginable. But the more the ethnic cleansing happens, the less imaginable is the kind of thing you seem to be imagining, which is national reconciliation. So that prospect does intrinsically get dimmer as more and more people have had relatives who have been killed by members of the other sect. That's the way the psychology works.
You would think, but you wouldn't think Sunnis would be talking to Sadr at this point. I mean, his people have just jeered, Hussein on the gallows. The Mahdi army is killing people in mixed neighborhoods in Iraq. And the Sunnis are still talking to Sadr. So
when you say the Sunnis, what? You mean like 7 politicians or something? Who are you talking about?
7 politicians that do not seem unrepresentative of the community. Go read the Juan Cole post. I'll put a link up.
I will. We should move on to another trouble spot, though.
Okay.
Somalia?
Yeah.
It's a good moment to just kind of freeze frame on for future reference because it's a triumphalist moment on the right. I mean, last week I said, like a number of people on the left, I said, the Ethiopian incursion was just underway with American backing implicitly and American arms and training and so on. And I said, I'm not sure this is a good idea. A lot of people who know the territory seem to think it's not a great idea. And I probably alluded to some kind of, prolonged war between Ethiopia and Somalia. Well, like 5 minutes after I finished that sentence, the opposition all resistance collapsed, more or less, and Ethiopia was triumphant. And so it's understandable that you get these triumphalist pieces, such as the sort that you sent me a link to, Ralph Peters of the New York Post.
Right. That was a classic triumphalist.
Well, I think he's the go-to guy for uncritical triumphalism. I mean, He's got a little Ann Coulter wackiness in it. I mean, I assume when it's not Ann Coulter saying it, it sounds a little worse to you. Like the opening sentence of this is, the new year is off to a bad start for Muslim extremists and their admirers in the media. Oh yeah, the American media is full of people who aspire themselves to be Muslim extremists, such as their admiration.
Wait a minute, but there are people who admired the Islamic Course movement because it was the first movement to bring an actual stable government to Somalia that wasn't ruled by criminal warlords.
Well, I don't know anybody who expressed what you would call admiration. Here was my logic. Let me tell you what my logic was. I see it all the time.
I see it all the time.
Okay, good. You can link to some of it, okay? Admiration we're looking for.
No, we're looking for people who admired the fact that they brought law and order, and that's one of the problems, is that now the warlords are back in charge, and it's not clear that they can have a stable government, and it's not clear that there won't be a guerrilla war.
Right. There's a difference between remarking on the fact that they brought order and admiring it. And by way of illuminating the distinction, let me just tell you where my mind was last week when we talked about it, okay? We were backing this Ethiopian insurgency or attack against the Islamic courts. And my feeling was we've kind of seen this movie before, because like 6-8 months ago, we were backing another proxy force against the Islamic courts. We were backing the warlords.
Right.
And it didn't work. And the warlords had been a failed force for like a decade, failing to bring order and bringing a kind of an ongoing mild level of chaos, destruction, and killing. And the Islamic courts, the fact that they did take over, notwithstanding our support for the opposition, and establish order, seemed to indicate that, I mean, they had done something that nobody else had done. I don't know if it's admiration to remark on that fact. The only reason I call attention to it is because it tells you what you're up against. You're up against something that at some level has more appeal to the Somalians than the alternatives that are in play. Now, if I thought that the Ethiopian incursion could match the warlords, I mean, the Islamic courts on that front, in other words, bring a kind of order to everyday life, I would be more enthusiastic. I still don't think they can, and the indications are that they realize that it is not in their interest to hang around and kind of try to do it. They're planning to withdraw. Right. The big question is, can the international community or somebody bring a force that will bring order to Somalia? If they can, then the Ethiopian incursion will have been a success. If we can provide an alternative to the Islamists that provide order, then probably this will be something I was willing to call a success. And I just remain pessimistic just because there doesn't...
Well, that's unlikely. The question is if there's a sort of more chaotic warlord-like situation and the Islamists are in the forest waging a guerrilla war, is that better off than what there was before?
No, because we've seen that movie, Mickey. We saw that movie 6 months ago. And what happens is the Islamists slowly take over and gin up support for what they want to do. And by the way, the other reason I was skeptical of American support for the intervention is the Americans were supporting the warlords 6 months ago, and at about that time there was apparently a struggle within the Islamic courts movement between a moderate and a radical. I gather the radical won, and my speculation at the time was, I mean, who knows what was determinative, but probably the fact that the Americans were visibly behind their opposition only empowered the radicals within that movement. That's my guess.
Well, there seems to have been a ham-handed CIA operation to enlist the warlords, yes.
Right.
But it's not clear to me that the Islamists in the bush are going to necessarily win. And also, but it is interesting that Zawahiri, however you pronounce it, Al-Qaeda number 2, has just issued or is about to issue a call for Islamists all the world over to come to the aid of these people in the bush.
Oh, of course. I mean, see, that's why it's not clear to me. I mean, Peters in this triumphalist piece asserts, without doubt, hey, having these Islamists running around in the bush beats having them ruling Mogadishu. That's not totally clear to me. He could be right, but you can imagine worse things than having them responsible for the behavior of the Somalian state, in which case they may be susceptible to the kind of leverage you have over nation states.
He's drawing an analogy to Afghanistan, where the Al-Qaeda was a threat when the Taliban were securely in power and they could have their training camps at peace, versus now where they're fighting a guerrilla war, and even if they're gaining in some areas, they're not in a position to launch another strike against the United States.
Yeah, but that's actually an interesting example, because we now know, I think, that before 9/11, there were people in the Taliban who were not at all enthusiastic about bin Laden and the way he was putting their state at risk, which we now know he absolutely did.
Well, yeah, but they didn't stop him.
No, they didn't stop him in the end, but the point is, it's not clear to me that initially extremist movements, once they are responsible for a nation state, are totally beyond manipulation and moderation in the long run. In any event, what I'm saying is, if the alternative to that is a prolonged period of chaos and Islamist insurrection that draws fighters from all over the world and gives them yet another anti-Western rallying cry, it's not clear to me that that is better than what the alternative would have been if we had seen what we could do by way of moderating, an initially Islamist government of Somalia. I don't know. I mean, there are no good choices. I'm just raising the possibility.
It's the flypaper strategy, Bob. It's brilliant.
Yeah.
We're attracting them so we can kill them.
Just like Iraq.
Although we're
pretty
not,
soon the whole world's going to be flypaper.
We're not. Thankfully, our troops are not involved in Somalia, so it's a little harder to portray it as, as us being the enemy as opposed to.
Well, no, but you see, we train and arm Ethiopia, so it's actually pretty easy for them to depict it that way. And I don't doubt that Ethiopia, gave us a heads up and we gave them a green light.
Oh, of course, but some other country is going to send peacekeepers. I think it was Uganda.
Well, I mean, one of the prices of the Iraq misadventure and various Bush misadventures, I think, is that one thing that can't happen is that the U.S. play a prominent role in organizing an international some sort of international force. We certainly can't be there physically. That would only energize the insurgents.
Better that Uganda play a prominent role in organizing an international force.
Well, if you can pull it off, but so far, the African, the African Union, as I guess it's now called, has not been terribly effectual in those kinds of situations.
Well, they're making all sorts of noises about how they're going to pull it off. I don't quite believe it either. But
I hope, someday that organization will mature to that point.
Well,
that's another trouble spot we've taken care of.
That and seeing the movie Black Hawk Down exhausts my knowledge of Somalia.
So what, you want to chide me about Andrew again?
No, actually, I have a little crow to eat. In the second half, you did sort of confront.
This is the second of the two interviews. It was actually one interview that went on so long I cut it up.
Right,
and you gave me a lot of grief about the first one, about not challenging his worldview.
Correct.
Although all we actually talked about was God, so it was a limit to how far I could challenge his political worldview. But anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
No, but in the second half, which I hadn't seen, you did confront his worldview about Iraq, and he issued an impressively abject apology
and disarming. It made it hard to persecute him any further.
That went on and on and on. I mean, I have a couple questions, and it also makes it hard. And it was not a Manichaean apology, so. It's hard for me to maintain my criticism of him that, he's just as self-righteous now that he's changed his mind as he was before, because he's not quite as self-righteous.
Well, that's the other thing I kind of liked about his book, is that sensibility is evident throughout it in the very tone of it.
As you pointed out, it is not evident on his blog.
Well, his blog is in a blog voice, and the book is a very different voice that I think reflects not just the fact that it's a book, but the fact that he has been, somewhat sobered up, like a lot of people, by the outcome of the Iraq War.
You also got the best of Andrew in your dialogue, and the blog sort of gets the worst of Andrew. The one charge I would stick to is...
What do you mean by the best of Andrew, by the way? Well, he's very likable and charming. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and he was uncertain and not bellicose, and he wasn't, calling his
that's
enemies,
kind of the way his book is.
He wasn't calling his enemies weak-kneed appeasers. And calling them a fifth column the way he did in his blog. There was a general toning down of the righteous editorial fury.
That's why I liked his book. Yeah.
Yeah, which was so that's why I think it was the best of Andrew. But he does have this post where he talks about what we should do in Iraq, where he says, if we leave, it's going to cause it will doubtless cause a bloodbath and genocide, but we should do it anyway. And it's because he's fed up with Bush, and he's had it with Bush. And so what if millions of people die, hundreds of thousands of people die in a genocide? Andrew Sullivan is fed up. It's a little bit. You see how he is sort of ruled by his emotions, as he sort of admits in his dialogue. But that's just not somebody you want to follow in a battle. Somebody who's, there's a Darwinian point, which is we're all ruled by our emotions, but some of us are aware of it, and not necessarily me, but a lot of people are aware of it and try to control them, and a lot of people sort of aren't aware of it and pretend that they're being totally logical when in fact they're being driven by their emotions.
Well, I haven't read the post you're talking about, but it's a more aware Andrew that you see in that book, is all I can repeat. Didn't you also have an issue on, you sent me the link to a post, didn't you, about the whole question of homophobia on the religious right?
Right. Well, first he thinks I'm somehow against gay marriage, which I'm not. I'm for gay marriage. I'm for gay marriage, but I have an open mind as to whether it'll work. If that makes me allergic.
Well, also, aren't you against the judicial approach to realizing it? Isn't it kind of like your position on Roe versus Wade?
I'm against thinking of it in Manichaean, this is our right constitutional terms, which I think Andrew falls prey to, because that doesn't leave any room for it not working out. And I think not only will it work out, but I think it will strengthen the institution of marriage. So I think it will be a win-win. But it just might not be. That's all. And if you phrase things in constitutional rights, you don't have the wiggle room to then say, well, this experiment failed.
So you would let states decide it on a state-by-state basis legislatively?
And this gets to the argument I had about Plano, Texas, where I think you have to convince these conservative religious red staters not that it's not a sin. I don't think they think it's a sin, but that it won't just add to the moral maelstrom that they see their children as developed in. And, Andrew on his post pretends not to understand what the concept of moral entropy is. Well, it means that they're worried about a sort of a formlessness and a rulelessness engulfing their children. It's not so much that they think, fornication between two men is an abomination to God and a sin and you're going to go to hell.
Okay.
And he seems unable to grasp that point. And a state-by-state approach would let you convince those suburban families that it's not a threat and that it's even a good thing.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I think we may have talked about this. I think one threat of a state-by-state approach on something like this is that it winds up deepening the red-blue fissure, because the blue states where gay marriage is legal become the place like that creative types go to college and stuff, and if a lot of these values issues are decided on a state-by-state basis, I really do think you could start to see slowly through migrational patterns a real deepening of the red-blue divide.
Good point, but won't Idaho at some point want a college and want to become a high-tech
By
center?
that point, the demographics are so adverse to that outcome that no, it won't happen. This leads me to your other argument that actually what you're seeing on the right isn't homophobia per se, but a concern about the coarseness of culture more broadly. And I'm actually somewhat sympathetic to that, but I think I have a stop you're both right kind of point to make with regard to you and Andrew on this, because I've made a kind of comparable argument to yours. I made it right after the election where, I guess a little over 2 years ago, where there was, those polls came out saying moral issues were so big. And I actually made the point that I think in a lot of cases it isn't, people think, abortion, gay marriage, but with, say, abortion, a lot of times it's not abortion per se, it's parents thinking that abortion, it's the promiscuity they're against, that they think that abortion is the remedy to. Right. And that, yes, you're right, that they're worried about moral decay in a very broad sense and what will happen to their teenage daughters and so on. But I think I can find that argument, and I would certainly do it now on reflection, to the kind of swing voters. In other words, the more moderate of the red state values voters. Right. I think that's true of. If you ask, is there genuine homophobia on the religious right, I think there actually is. And I know some people on the religious right. I don't know if you know or actually on close terms with some. I'm related to some. And I will tell you that they think homosexuality is evil.
I wasn't saying that there was no homophobia on the religious right. Jesus.
Well, isn't that part of the argument, that he wants to characterize the sentiment on the religious right that way, and you're saying, hold on?
No, he wants to characterize his main foe in terms of getting gay marriage as these crazy homophobes on the religious right, and it's not. He can get it without them. We can get it without them.
By appealing to the swing votes,
to these more moderate suburbanites who are not homophobic, but are just worried about, what you said.
As a political matter, I may agree with you if you're saying that there's a relatively small number of swing votes you could sway, you could move, toward support for gay marriage, if you satisfied their concerns on other fronts. But it's certainly not the case that a gay person is hallucinating if he or she sees out-and-out homophobia in large segments of the religious right.
Yeah, but it doesn't do much good to portray all opponents to gay marriage as homophobes any more than it did to portray all opponents of welfare reform as racist.
No, I wouldn't portray them that way.
Some are, but it's a very self-satisfied liberal position to take as I'm the crusader against these horrible homophobes, when that's not really moving the ball politically.
Let me say one more thing on this. You, in your blog post, you quote, I don't know who this is you're quoting. Who's the, this piece you're quoting is from who? The libertarian?
Virginia Postrel wrote a piece where she went to Plato and talked to people to find out just what made these alleged red staters tick. I had implied that they were really all liberals because they were rich, and she was saying, no, Kaus is wrong. You can be rich and conservative too, but...
And here's a quote from her piece, I think, from your blog item. but Plano parents want to determine when and where they talk to their kids about sex, and they assume that explaining that some men fall in love with other men is, quote, about sex. Let me just say that I think if this is their perception, they're the opposite of right. And here I have a touching family anecdote, which is how we explained gay love to my daughters, which is that we visited some friends of mine who were gay and lived together, and brought the kids, and it was in exactly the kind of setting that you would have more of if gay marriage were legal. And had a pleasant afternoon. Afterwards, they inquired about their living situation. Two guys living together, and we explained. Most men fall in love with women, some men fall in love with men. And they were fine with that. They found it kind of amusing. But it was the most innocent and least sexual way to explain homosexuality to two young kids that you can imagine. So I just think if this is what parents in Plano are thinking, they should rethink.
Well, maybe this is a new technique. Gay marriage will be so prevalent that you can explain the birds and the bees to your heterosexual kids by analogy to the rock of gay marriage.
The point is, it's true that parents are reluctant to talk to young children about sex generally, certainly including homosexual sex. But
the point is, you're right. These suburban moms and fathers' minds can be changed, and in fact, they are being changed. And as more states adopt gay marriage, the percentage of the people who disapprove of gay marriage, as Andrew Sullivan will be the first to tell you, is going down. So, and Frank Rich would tell you, quite rapidly, minds are being changed.
Now, we've come a long way. I'll tell you, I had never heard of the prospect of gay marriage until Andrew wrote that cover piece for the New Republic, whenever, 15 years ago or something, or a little more.
As I recall, we commissioned it from him.
Well, he was at the magazine. I don't know.
No, he was at Harvard, I think.
Was he?
I think he was.
He was a presence. He was around the halls.
I think he was off getting his doctorate.
In any event, I just remember Mike Kinsley being excited about the cover illustration of two men on a wedding cake. But I also remember I had never heard of the prospect, and I just thought, whoa, that's pretty disorienting to think about. And now, it's taken, it's come a very long way.
And for people, but for people to say, not to say we're making great progress, let's make some more, and to say, oh, we have to smite those horrible homophobes on the religious right, seems to be a lack of perspective.
Well, you can save that for your coming dialogue with Andrew, Mickey.
I look forward to that.
Yeah, probably more than he does. The other thing, though, you were critical of both my Andrew and my Glenn Reynolds dialogue. Interesting pattern, though. If you look at what you complained about with my Glenn Reynolds thing, it was that I didn't, help him further unfold his worldview. Your complaint, I went back and looked at what you're complaining about. It's true there was a follow-up question I could have asked. I could have had him elaborate on a point. Instead, I challenged his worldview. And when it's people like him that you agree with, it's bad for me to challenge their worldviews. And when it's people like Andrew you disagree with, it's bad to be nice to
challenge both of their worldviews. But
anyway, you should at least do one with Glenn, because he might.
You did in the second half, so I'm withdrawing the charge.
Okay, so you withdraw that. You should still do one with Glenn Reynolds.
I should, and I probably won't have the balls to challenge him any more than you do, but that doesn't mean
I say, watch the videotape. I was as effective as you could be while being extremely civil, and given the short amount of time we had. I do not accept your characterization of me as however you vulgarly put it.
I just think you should have said, Glenn, you think we shouldn't sit on our bayonets, we should have gone on to military action against Iran. Isn't that a pretty high-stakes strategy?
Did I say that? What I said was that wouldn't solve the problem we're facing now, which seems to me a fairly fundamental challenge. Anyway, this is all inside baseball. You should do one with him.
I'd love to do one with him. He's a nice guy.
He was a nice guy, partly because I was such a nice guy. Possibly.
Well, you have that effect.
On just about everyone. So are you, I guess, today we had this, in the House of Representatives, the gavel changed hands, ending 12 years of Republican rule and ushering the first female speaker. So I assume that your liberal heart is swelling with pride, Mickey?
No, of course not. First, this is basically political theater. It's one of these big events that the media has to get all excited about, but it doesn't really signify all that much. It's not completely contentless, but it's, the big issues down the road are, healthcare, immigration, Social Security, No Child Left Behind. They're not going to be dealt with right away, and we don't quite know what's going to happen with them. I'm in dread that something's going to happen very bad on immigration. When Gingrich took the gavel, I admit I was in less dread because I thought something very good might happen with welfare reform, and in fact, that's what happened. So I claim that my distaste is rooted in substance, not self-loathing, but not democratic self-hatred. But
I won't pick up that particular gauntlet. But I'm cynical about congressional politics too, because the theater kind of grosses me out too. But I will say two things. First of all, what I caught of it on TV, I actually thought she handled pretty well. Did you watch the thing?
No,
she did this thing at the end, which was just this close to going too far and getting too cute, which was encouraged a bunch of young kids to come up and touch the gavel. It was this close to too far, but I thought it worked, and maybe only because she was a woman did she get away with it. But I thought it was reasonably effective theater. The other thing is, and also her talk was just kind of short. It was like a third of the length of Gingrich's opening oratory 12 years ago. I thought it was fine. The other thing is, I'm not keeping up with all the issues they plan to solve in their 100-hour onslaught, but I happened to be walking by the TV when CNN was reviewing the calendar, the coming agenda, and the very last item, which I guess is like the 100th hour or something, I thought was very good. It was end subsidies to oil companies, use the money to invest in alternative renewable energies. That is something that's good for the environment, good for America's national security, and something that if Bush were a better president, he would have done a long time ago. He could have done it after 9/11. In a heartbeat could have gotten it.
But that's probably one of those things that is theater because Bush isn't going to sign it, as opposed to some of the other things they're doing which aren't theater. Like,
I'm actually not sure how easy it will be for Bush not to sign that in the current climate, so to speak. I mean, because part of it is the growing agreement that global warming is real. But also the foreign policy climate, when a number of conservatives are saying that for national security reasons, we've got to get ourselves off of oil.
I think it'll be hard to. It's historically hard to get rid of oil subsidies in the Senate, where Democratic senators from oil-rich states tend to go to the other side.
Well, anyway, it's good public policy.
But there are some things they're doing, and this is something that only the LA Times points out, that don't need Bush's signature. Their ethics rules don't need Bush's signature; they just go into effect. The budget rules don't need Bush's signature. The pay-as-you-go rules, they just go into effect. And the minimum wage thing may well get Bush's signature. So those are three things that actually might happen that they're doing, which is why it's not all empty theater.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the empowering Medicare to negotiate with drug companies is probably not such a solution for the reasons that Mike Kinsley pointed out in Slate, which is, the marginal cost of drugs is so low that nobody knows where to price them. And if you really let the government exercise its full monopsony buying power, they'll probably bid the price down to where it's too low to fund the next generation of drugs. I mean,
wait a second. That's a little bit of a red herring, as I understand it. I mean, the traditional claim of drug companies is we have to reap big profits on our path-breaking innovations because that's what gives us the incentive to do the research and create the next generation of drugs. I've been told by people who seem to know what they were talking about that if you look at where the research money comes from, a huge portion of it comes from our tax dollars. There's a huge amount of federally funded research, and the amount of basic research that yields new drugs that really comes from the drug companies themselves is not that huge. And to the extent that that's true, then their argument doesn't hold up.
Well, I think a lot of the money doesn't go to basic research. It goes to getting the drug approved, which is a totally legitimate cost. It costs like $1 billion or something to get a drug approved. They have to get that $1 billion from somewhere.
Well, there's probably a case for both streamlining that process and reducing the length of the patents that they hold.
I mean, usually when you have a monopoly on one side, you wind up with a distortion in the market. And that's probably true just as much when the government has a monopoly as when the oil companies have a monopoly. And it's also true that the market rules don't work when marginal costs keep on decreasing and never rise, as they do for software probably and for drugs. And nobody knows what the heck to do. But
you mean when the government is bargaining with them, in possession of something like monopoly bargaining power?
Yes.
But it's not the only bargainer. The drug companies will they not, sell a lot of drugs through private insurance companies.
I guess that's right, but I think Medicare has so much bargaining power.
Has a lot.
That they can basically drive down the price below the optimal level. In any case, it's not the panacea for rising healthcare costs because the Democrats think it is, because healthcare costs are going to rise for all sorts of reasons, including that good new drugs that are expensive are going to be invented, and we want them to be invented.
Well,
and we have
there's
to figure out how
actually
to pay the cost, not just how to bargain down the evil drug company.
Actually, if there is a trade-off between how fast new drugs will be created and how equally current medical resources will be distributed, it's not self-evident that you want to maximize the former, that at all costs, including costs to current equality in the distribution of medical resources, you want to maximize the rate at which drugs. That's your point of view as somebody who can afford all the drugs they invent, but it's not self-evident.
No, but I tend to be much more against slowing down the rate of development than you are. A, because I think those drugs trickle down, and B, I'm willing to spend a much larger portion of GDP on healthcare than probably you are.
I think so.
I don't mind if why shouldn't we spend 50% of our GDP on healthcare? I don't understand.
Why not 100?
Well, 100 then we wouldn't need, Bob, but
99.
50 seems a reasonable number, and right now it's about 20, right? So
I don't know.
Got a long way to go.
I don't know. I've said everything I know about that subject.
I should find the hypochondriacs lobby to lobby for spending ever-increasing sums of GDP on healthcare.
Now, okay, so we were talking about Nancy Pelosi. Natural transition to another alpha female whom you find threatening.
Well, it's interesting. The more Pelosi becomes public and does a good job or a bad job, the more she either puts Hillary in the shade or poisons the well for Hillary. So
this is a point somebody brought up on CNN, but you're right. It's okay for us to make an MSM-type point every once in a while.
I made that point months ago. It was suggested to me by my friend Scott Coffer.
Before CNN said it.
Before.
No, I think that's probably
way
true.
Before.
But now you had made this prediction about Hillary not ultimately running for president, and Mark Schmidt had made it earlier and somewhat more forcefully on Bloggingheads TV, but you'll both get credit if it turns out to be true.
I still think it's a live possibility. I mean, Bob, as is my fashion, I've been hobnobbing with the Hollywood elite.
I know.
This previous weekend.
I know.
Juan Williams said Obama will have trouble raising money from Hollywood. He was so wrong. It's one of the wrongest thing ever said. Obama's biggest problem will be to stop these rich people from trampling each other and trying to boost their egos by being the one that organizes the fundraisers for Obama. They're all ready to go for Obama.
At the expense of Hillary.
Sorry?
At the expense of Hillary.
Well, sure, at the expense of Hillary. And, Ari Emanuel, Rahm Emanuel's brother, is for Obama. He's a big Hollywood agent. I heard that Harold Ickes was secretly for Obama, although he's nominally for Hillary. Harold Ickes is Hillary's consigliere. He's the guy that got her elected to the Senate. If she loses Harold Ickes, she's in big trouble. And this story over the weekend in the Times, or this previous week, about how she's having all these meetings and she's nearing a decision. I don't think that didn't convince me that she was definitely going to run. In fact, it had a whole part in there about how she's worried that if she's running, she won't be able to accomplish as much as she wants to in the Senate. That tells me that she really cares about the Senate, and the alternative to her running for president is becoming majority leader of the Senate.
Okay.
And so that implied to me that she's facing a real quandary.
What do you think of a Gore-Obama ticket?
Love it.
You like it?
I do like it, yes.
That seems potentially quite effective to me.
But why would Obama want to go for that?
Well, this would, of course, depend on Gore showing, A, running, and B, showing tremendous strength. Obama would be settling for it. That's the way people make the transition from presidential to vice presidential candidates.
That's a good idea.
I really think it because, you know, there's going to be a lot of lingering doubts about Obama's, you know, experience and so on. And this phase of infatuation is going to pass, even though he may lock up a lot of money in the meanwhile. And, you know, you get all the sex appeal of him, pretty much, and none of those doubts if he's a vice presidential candidate.
Well, but you, on the other hand, you get all the downside of him, which is, you know, some people are reluctant to vote for a black guy. And,
well, no, they're much less reluctant if he's vice president. I mean, I think the downside is he outshines the number one guy. I mean, some people might argue that he's somewhat more fluid than Al Gore, although, you know, like other people, you've seen Al Gore, you know about the Al Gore, the private Al Gore who's loose and funny and so on.
Well, yeah, but if you look at you know, I hew to my worries about Gore from Florida. If you look at the actual decisions he made in Florida when he was in charge and, you know, running a campaign to get the ballots recounted the same way, you know, a general would run a campaign, he made a lot of really bad decisions.
Yeah, and the Bush administration made the right ones, and that's why Bush has turned out to be such a strategic mastermind on the global stage. You're right.
No,
that Florida experience should really be our weather vane.
Bush will be gone in 2008. We'll be talking about...
Well, right, but the point is how a person conducted himself during that turns out to say more about, you know, whether he hired James Baker than whether he'd be a good president.
No, it doesn't. But Gore... He wanted to be the smartest guy in the room. He gave these tutorials with a you know, I don't know if it was a PowerPoint or a pad. He was giving these lectures instead of getting the information from the bottom up, to, you know, as fast as possible, and having, you know, smart people who he trusted around him. Those are congenital defects in decision making. I don't think they're fatal, and, you know, a lot of the good decisions Clinton made, apparently he made at Gore's prodding. So it's not. I'm just saying that I'm troubled, and one wants to know what the interaction between Gore and Obama will be. Maybe Obama will correct Gore's flaws.
So has this been documented? Has this case been made in writing?
Oh, I'm sure if you read like Jake Tapper's book about Florida and all the books about Florida, you would see that he counted the wrong ballots. He counted the undervotes and he should have counted the overvotes. And he didn't find out that the overvotes were the key to his victory until a day too late.
So you think he could have won?
Yes.
Is that really conventional wisdom?
If he'd done the right thing and called for a statewide recount of undervotes and overvotes right away, without cherry-picking these districts, he might well have won, yes.
Might well have won. Interesting thesis.
And so anyway, and there were people urging him to do that, so it's not pure hindsight.
Now, do we really want to tackle free will?
I don't know. I don't have a choice in the matter because there's no free will, right?
You're right. I mean, I just read this New York Times piece and thought, and saw that it was climbing the New York Times most emailed list, and thought that was kind of amusing. I mean, the very idea of a newspaper piece about free will is kind of funny, because the fact is that kind of no new evidence on the question has come in, like in the last week or month or year, you know.
Well, but the guy had obviously been saving up string for a long time, and
for a quarter of a century, I would say.
It was a fun
piece. It was.
It's a fun middlebrow article.
And it started out with the issue of resisting chocolate, and since that bears pretty directly on one of my New Year's resolutions, it caught my attention. And I don't know. Do you have any questions, Mickey?
Well, yeah. I mean, why? This is like a completely crazy question and probably reveals me as an idiot. But in your thinking about the mind-body problem, you sort of portray consciousness as something of a miracle. We could all be robots without consciousness, yet we have consciousness. So, gee, what function does it serve? It doesn't serve a function. It's just like a great thing we have. Why couldn't free will be exactly the same type of thing?
Well, free will would, by definition, serve a function because it would influence our behavior. The view of consciousness I'm talking about, not necessarily endorsing, although it's a reasonable one, is the view that consciousness has no influence on behavior, but is a mere epiphenomenon, like a shadow cast by the material world that in turn does not influence the material world.
Right.
So, if that is what subjective experience is, and that's actually a common view, either implicitly or explicitly, then the question arises of what it's doing here, because in that view it actually has no function. So, And yeah, I've made a big deal of that. There's no point getting into it deeply because you start losing a large audience share when you start. But
I think we start gaining audience share.
You think so?
You start talking about miracles, man.
Well, miracles are good, but the thing about consciousness is the whole mind-body problem is when people disagree about it, it isn't just that they disagree, it's that they can't even understand the position of the other person. It's just that in the nature of the deal, it's like...
but the mind-body problem is different from the free will problem.
It is different, but closely related. And that...
and why is it closely related?
Well, first of all, because... I mean, there's two conflicting positions. A, that free will exists, and B, that no, everything is completely determined. Actually, both of those are implied by the way people look at the world, which is to say, okay, free will, you know, we all feel we have it. When we talk about blaming people for things, we talk as if they had it. So we all actually, at one level, have the intuition that free will exists. On the other hand, when you hear about the way we talk about the world, we say things like, well, if it happened, there must be a reason. Everything that happens has a cause. And we also talk about causes as if they have unique consequences, right? I mean, if I throw the rock at the window at a certain velocity, the window will break, right? I mean, that's the way people talk about causality, and that, in turn, implies complete determinism. So the funny thing about this the whole issue is that if you examine the way we look at the world, you'll see that both of the conflicting views on free will are actually ones that you implicitly hold at varying times in your life, right?
Right.
So but if there's one, I mean, you ask, what does consciousness have to do with it? Certainly part of the intuition on the pro-free will side is that I feel the volitional process. I feel myself taking control and deciding to do things. That is subjective. It's as if the subjective realm, the realm of consciousness, is influencing the world. And one of the scientific findings that Dennis Overby mentions in this piece is, and I guess it's reliable, I've always wondered how you could really establish this, but there is apparently a big body suggesting that in some cases the conscious intention to do something actually comes a fraction of a second after the physiological things that initiate the behavior. Okay, that's one kind of finding that calls into question this idea that, you know, we feel the volition and it's really what causes things.
I was very suspicious of that because it involved motion, deciding what motions to do, which is something you would logically think might happen before you thought about it. And it didn't involve sort of more intellectual tasks where you would think the thought and the action would be more simultaneous. And the other thing is they talked about how, well, you know, your id or subconscious or whatever can initiate the action, but your conscious can sort of veto it. So it seemed to me that didn't resolve the issue.
Well, the other problem I have with that experiment is all they can ultimately measure is your report about when you felt, you know, you wanted to do something. And I'm not clear how they infer from the moment when your report of that arrives when you actually felt. I don't know. But I just haven't looked into this stuff.
That's a good point. I probably would feel a vague, inchoate distaste at seeing Nancy Pelosi wield the gavel and being touched by America's children. But until you point it out to me, it's not really conscious.
What?
Does that make it? Is that a good analogy? It just seems, just because you don't sort of consciously acknowledge that you're making a decision, does that mean that you don't have free will? I don't quite understand that.
Well, remember, when I tell you something, you can describe the process of communication in sheerly physical terms. Sound waves come out of my mouth, they enter your ear, they go in and they get processed as physical information is in a computer, and the processing generates a physiological reaction which generates words that come out of your mouth saying, oh, that grosses me out.
Right.
And part of the question of consciousness is, well, then why does the subjective experience associated with that have to exist at all?
Right.
I don't know if that answers your question, but...
It doesn't. The studies you referred to that show that the subjective experience of making a decision follows your body actually making the decision just didn't seem wildly convincing to me, that's all.
No, I am skeptical, but I haven't looked into them. And in general, my position on this is, I think the whole free will and consciousness questions are reasons for people to have a little more kind of humility about our ability to really understand the world than they do. To me, they are profound and utter mysteries, and I just don't know. And there's a little, for my money, too much. I actually don't like the word scientism because the kinds of people who usually use it, but there is such a thing as being a little too, scientists being a little too imperialistic in terms of the questions they claim to be able to settle, and I think this is one. And when people say, you know, free will is ridiculous or consciousness is easy to understand, I just think that's not the case, and that's kind of unduly. It's a little arrogant, and it gives science a bad name, and it sours people.
Are these things you go into on our sister site, Meaning of Life TV, or your sister site?
Yeah, I mean, I argue with, for example, Dan Dennett, who was mentioned in this Times piece, is I argue with him about consciousness at length, and also you can see his own views on free will. I don't especially challenge them. He has this kind of eccentric view. There's a tradition of this, but that actually free will and determinism are not incompatible. It's called a compatibilist position, but I think there's one point in this piece that illustrates what I'm talking about a kind of unreflective, in my mind, arrogant dismissal of the problem. I'm not sure if this is Dennis Overby talking or he's paraphrasing somebody, but he's talking about the view that kind of free will is something immaterial that can indeed intervene and affect the material world. He says, but whatever that power is, call it soul or the spirit, those people, that is, people who believe in it, have to explain how it could stand independent of the physical universe and yet reach from the immaterial world and meddle in our own, jiggling brain cells that lead us to say the words whatever. And he's kind of mocking that view. But to my mind, the interface between, if you grant that the subjective experience or consciousness can be described as immaterial, then in my mind, the interface between the material and this so-called immaterial world is no less mysterious, even if you take a different view of it, namely that epiphenomenal view I just mentioned, right? So even if you say, well, the physical world casts subjective experience as a shadow, there is still what I think Colin McGinn calls the water into wine problem of, wait a second, how is it? How can we even begin to conceive how a physical process would, be transformed into this stuff we call subjective experience? In other words, the interface between those two seems to me a total mystery, regardless of in which direction you're asserting the causality is moving.
Seems
fascinating, huh?
It seems less mysterious, but to me...
Exactly. It is... See, I think intuitively it does seem less mysterious, but I maintain that if you try to articulate why it's more mysterious moving in one direction than the other, I maintain you'll have a little trouble and realize that you shouldn't take for granted the idea that there's an asymmetrical implausibility there.
Can we put up a link to some Meaning of Life TV discussion just in case any of our listeners and viewers are at all interested in this?
Yeah. Certainly some consciousness links and a couple of Dan Dennett links would probably do it. We can do that.
Cool.
But in any event, we've settled the matter, and it's about time. I mean, philosophers have been at it for what, a millennium?
I think that's pretty good.
Yeah, I know. We did it, what was that, 10 minutes?
And we settled Somalia, too, so there you go.
Yeah.
I have a feeling the electrician is about to come.
To your house? You want to say anything about comments? Do you have a comment of the week or an email of the week?
I forgot that part.
Okay, well, let me just say again, I think our commenters are like at an astoundingly kind of high level.
I agree.
There was. I mean, it was kind of after the second part of my Andrew Sullivan. Well, the first part aired first, but the second part was already in the can, and I read this comment from Bloggingheads, which I guess is kind of an allusion to Bloggingheads when you think about it, but that's his pen name. I hope Bob will press Andrew in the next half on how the conservatism of doubt, which is Andrew's term, differs from classical liberalism. Excellent question. Good example of something I didn't have the brains to ask. And then there was a very good exchange between him and Wolfgangus on that really brought to my attention a new analytical point about faith and the nature of faith and how it's actually deployed by people who disdain it. Lisa Moscatiello put in a comment that actually, remember the Kagan question? Frederick Kagan and Robert Kagan are brothers. Did you know that?
I did know that, because
never mind.
The Guide to the Kagans explains that.
But also their father is Donald Kagan.
I knew that, too.
Okay, but the interesting thing about that is, he writes about Athens, Peloponnesian War, etc. There is a thing about right-wing hawks, more than left-wing hawks, are fascinated by ancient history. Have you ever noticed that?
That's true. I guess Victor David Hansen would be another one, too.
No, it's true. And I maintain it's part of the problem that they fail to appreciate how technology has changed the battlefield.
Very good point.
Well, no, let me quickly mention this Hans Blix point and clarify. This is a comment from Sintesi. I brought up with Andrew the fact that we now know, Hans Blix had done a bunch of inspections. Couldn't find any nukes. And I learned from a recent interview with Hans Blix that, a list that they were going down, I gather, pretty systematically, was the one American intelligence had provided. So, and I don't remember this being highlighted before the war.
No,
the fact that it wasn't just that where they looked they had failed to find things. It was that they were systematically discrediting, as I understand Blix's remarks, and I admit that they're a little ambiguous, and they're linked to from that Andrew dialogue, the second one. But that Bush, it didn't dawn on me, maybe it was almost self-evident, but certainly the Bush administration would have understood if they were providing him the list from American intelligence, and the UN inspectors were going down and showing wrong.
Well, why couldn't the Bushies say, oh, well, Saddam has just gotten there ahead of us?
Well,
and he's secreting them all in Syria or something.
That may be the kind of story they told themselves, but my point was, that maybe, if I'm interpreting this right, they had more reason to believe than we had direct access to that our own intelligence was faulty. And that if they had looked at things soberly, they would have really confronted that question before the war even started. Hey, wait a second, maybe our intelligence just totally sucks.
Well, I believe that, but I think they wanted a war with Iraq anyway for other reasons. And you
right, but the question I brought up is it not pretty close to criminal for a president to keep that kind of information to himself and keep talking as if he has reliable intelligence information?
You think Roosevelt told everybody everything before we got into World War II?
Hey, I'd be willing to indict him if it meant indicting Bush. I don't know. I don't know whether there was a comparable sin on his part. But I'm just saying that if I understand this Hans Blix interview correctly, there's a little more reason to question Bush's veracity and candor with the American people than there was before that Blix interview.
No, I agree. That's interesting, but
And apparently, judging by this comment, that wasn't totally clear from what I said to Andrew. So I repeat it.
I thought it was clear. You're for impeachment. You and John Conyers.
No, I'm actually not. I think censure would be nice. I don't think the Democrats should get into the impeachment business. I don't.
If he had other patriotic reasons for going to war, I don't think you impeach the guy. But anyway.
Well, is this the longest ever?
It's pretty long.
Yeah.
I say we should put it out of its misery.
I think we should.
Okay.
All right. See you next time.
See you next week. Bye.
Bye.